A man had a close encounter with a truck and arrived in the other world he had always dreamed of. However, not only did he not want any cheat codes, but he also wished to escape the hustle and bustle of life. To prevent the protagonist from starving to death at the start, the god thoughtfully prepared a starting gift package for him, including a freezer full of food and a house inaccessible to monsters. Just as the protagonist began to research how to unleash cool magic, he discovered that he could only release water and couldn't use magic at all. Suddenly, a flash of inspiration struck him. He remembered his chemistry knowledge from his previous life. Looking at the basin of water in front of him, he imagined himself combining hydrogen molecules and hydrogen atoms, successfully freezing the water in the basin into ice. Then, he successfully started a fire using a magnifying glass made of ice, took an ice bath, and the next morning remembered that the food the gods had prepared for him would only last 2 months. He still needed to train, so he immediately began practicing water magic. However, the power of the water spheres was pitifully weak. He then thought of directly spraying water, but that was also somewhat ineffective. However, with diligent practice, the power significantly increased. That evening, using the same principle as ice making, he created hot water. But compared to this useless water boiling magic, he preferred ice spikes, a magic useful for hunting. However, since it was his first, the protagonist failed to launch the water ball slash spray successfully on his first attempt. Unable to find a better feel for it, he repeatedly launched water balls and jets. After practicing for a while, he had made no progress except for exhausting his magic power. Desperate, he resorted to the most primitive method, hunting. While passing a stream, he discovered quartz. With it, he could live even without sunlight. However, just as he was searching for an antidote, a small wild boar targeted him. Because it was his first real battle, he froze for a moment, but fortunately managed to avoid the impact. Afterward, he composed himself and used Ice Demon and Ice Spikes, successfully counterattacked and killed the wild boar. Returning home that evening, the protagonist flipped through a monster encyclopedia. Seeing the dragon and demon marked as special class monsters, he sighed, but didn't dwell on it. The protagonist continued his daily forest explorations. Then one day, while eating fruit, he was suddenly attacked by a monster. However, after consulting the monster encyclopedia, he immediately recognized it as an assassin eagle. After analyzing its weaknesses, he engaged it in combat. Just as the eagle charged at him, the protagonist unleashed an ice wall, instantly knocking the eagle to the ground. Because its eye was injured, the eagle, after memorizing the protagonist's appearance, flew away. Seeing this, the protagonist, he breathed a sigh of relief. However, because he had been chased by the assassin eagle for so long, the protagonist got lost in the forest. He didn't find his way home until late at night. But while passing a lake, he encountered a headless horseman, not even listed in the monster encyclopedia. Fortunately, the horseman wasn't hostile, allowing him to leave. A long time passed, and the protagonist continued to explore the forest every day. Although he still encountered powerful monsters, they were nothing to him now that he could use ice spikes. Through this period of training, his magic became increasingly proficient, and every night he would challenge the headless horseman to a duel. Although each time beaten to a pulp, the headless knight didn't seem intent on killing the protagonist. Instead, it appeared to be training him in swordsmanship. And today, when the protagonist was defeated again, the knight gave him its ice sword and left. Some time passed, and the assassin eagle returned. Although it appeared to be purified, the protagonist had long since mastered its abilities and could now defend against the eagle's relentless air slashes. Seeing its attacks ineffective, the eagle swooped down, and the protagonist tumbled out of 10 layers of ice walls. However, the high-speed impact was unbearable. After the protagonist dodged the attack, the assassin eagle used an air slash. Taking advantage of the protagonist's defensive gap, the assassin eagle used a sonic attack, rendering the protagonist unable to cast any magic. Forced to engage in close combat with his sword, the protagonist, relying on the swordsmanship he learned from the headless horseman, struck the assassin eagle's vital point. But after winning, the protagonist wasn't overjoyed. Instead, he felt respect for the assassin eagle. It was because he anticipated the assassin eagle's revenge that the protagonist had grown so rapidly during this time. Therefore, the protagonist was actually grateful to the assassin eagle. That being said, however, the protagonist didn't win. He gave the assassin, the eagle, with a swift and decisive strike, finally granted the protagonist the final dignity of a warrior. On his way home, the protagonist unexpectedly encountered a powerful, magical dragon. "I have a question for you," the dragon asked. "Do you think there are any other birds around here?" the dragon inquired. Fortunately, the dragon meant no harm. Facing such a powerful monster, the protagonist dared not lie and had to tell the truth. Thankfully, the dragon wasn't one of the dragon's familiars. More than that, the dragon wanted to know what kind of sword the protagonist carried. When the protagonist held out his hand, the dragon saw it was a part of the Fairy King's weapon. The dragon then realized that the protagonist had gained the Fairy King's approval. The two chatted until dusk before the dragon bid farewell and departed. Meanwhile, the gods were astonished to discover that the protagonist possessed a very rare hidden trait. His name was Brown, meaning he had a near-infinite lifespan. Following the previous episode, the protagonist went to the beach to fish, only to find a large ship stranded. It seemed the people on board had been dead for some time, but the protagonist noticed one person was still alive. Seeing this, the protagonist decisively took the man home. The man, after regaining consciousness, thanked the protagonist and gave his name. He then told the protagonist what had happened. It turned out they had been attacked by a giant octopus during their voyage, and he was the only survivor. Just as the protagonist was comforting him, Abel smiled faintly and said not to worry, it's just some smuggled food, isn't it? As he spoke, Abel's stomach growled. Seeing this, the protagonist had no choice but to cook him some food. Abel seemed a little embarrassed since the protagonist looked like a poor man, yet he had been given such a lavish meal. The protagonist could only explain that he lived alone there, and when his clothes were torn, he had nowhere to get them. The food was all earned through his own labor. He even showed off a bit. Water magic. After dinner, Abel had the protagonist take him back to the stranded beach. However, the bodies of the smugglers were all gone. Abel suspected they had been eaten by something and didn't think much of it. He then searched the shipwreck, but it seemed he found nothing. He then asked the protagonist about his future plans, but the protagonist said he didn't know. Seeing this, Abel invited him to travel with him to a town called Rune. The protagonist readily agreed. After all, he had been a savage for many years, and it was time to go out and see the world. That night, they returned to the cabin for a short rest. The protagonist remarked that staying here for so long was really getting tiring. Late at night, the protagonist went alone into the forest to meet the Headless Horseman. He told the horseman he would be leaving for a while and thanked him. Then they engaged in a final battle. The protagonist fought fiercely and ultimately fought to a draw. Before parting, the Headless Horseman gave the protagonist a robe. The next day, the protagonist donned the new robe and set off on a journey with Abel. While traversing the forest, they encountered a small wild boar. Abel used her fighting skills to easily defeat the boar. The protagonist was astonished, as he had never heard of anything other than magic. Afterwards, they encountered a group of lizard men. Not wanting to fight in the swamp, the protagonist and his companions chose a detour, but were still discovered by the lizard men. Forced to fight, they declared they would fight this time and used ice lance, easily defeating several lizard men. Abel was stunned. He had heard from his magic sealing friend that a single cast of heroic chant could only release one weapon, yet the protagonist had released four. Unable to explain, he made up an excuse and continued onward. Along the way, Abel gave the protagonist a coin. The protagonist remarked that this was the first time he had ever seen money. Abel explained, this is the currency circulating in the kingdom where Rune resides. Although the currency is issued by different countries, the units of currency are interchangeable. Soon after, the two finally emerged from the forest and arrived at a plain. But they hadn't gone far when Abel noticed something was wrong with the surrounding rocks. He slashed with his sword, and the male protagonist used an ice wall to block the attack. The two were suddenly surrounded by rocks. It turned out they had stumbled upon the lair of the Balrog. Abel used a fighting technique, but it was useless. At this moment, the male protagonist said he had a skill he wanted to use. This instantly sent the Balrog to the second dimension. After the battle, they discovered a fiery golem lay motionless on the ground. It turned out the golem's energy came from the magic stone beneath its feet. The magic stone absorbed the earth's energy, so it wouldn't move when it fell. The two had never seen such a large magic stone before, so they kept it as their loot. Afterwards, they watched the battle between the hippopotamus and the dragons. However, the hippopotamus used a sonic attack, quickly defeating a group of dragons. That night, the two sat by the campfire. Abel mentioned that the hippopotamus's attack during the day was most likely a magic nullification technique, and there were many such traps in the dungeon. Hearing about the dungeon, the protagonist expressed his desire to explore it. Just then, the two headed to Rune, where there was an underground city and skilled dwarves who were adept at blacksmithing. The next morning, Abel couldn't help but wonder how the protagonist, this savage, knew the direction to Rune. The protagonist recalled his previous conversation with the dragon, where the dragon had told him where the human city was. After recalling this, the protagonist said that some things were better left unsaid. Abel didn't say anything more. After some time, the two arrived in the northern mountains. There, they encountered a griffin. Fortunately, the griffin was just hungry and left after getting its food, much to the relief of the two. Afterwards, the two said, this land is quite unusual. It seems this mountain range is blocking monsters like hippos and dragons from reaching inhabited areas. Speaking of dragons, the protagonist recalls the dragon he fought with the hippopotamus. It seemed to have flown from the north. Sure enough, the two soon spotted two dragons. Abel remarked that monsters of this caliber would require at least 20 adventurers to slay. The protagonist, however, disregarded this and used several ice spears to pin the two dragons to the ground. Abel also successfully caught a sword. After collecting the magic stones, the two continued their journey and finally saw the northern continent, the place they were heading to. Following the previous episode, the two protagonists finally emerged from the northern mountains, and ahead lay a town called Karate. Fortunately, there was a tavern nearby where they could rest. There, Abel introduced the protagonist to the Adventurers Guild. Registering as an adventurer exempted them from all domestic customs duties, and materials like magic stones could be exchanged for money. After all, without money, they could only use them for things like alchemy. Hearing about alchemy, the protagonist's eyes lit up. Just then, a waiter interrupted their conversation. The curry the protagonist had had ordered was ready. Seeing the curry rice, the protagonist sighed with relief, as he hadn't eaten modern food since his close encounter with the Great Fortune. After a satisfying meal, the two headed to the town. Upon arriving, Abel explained the adventurer ranks to the protagonist, and since Abel was a B rank or higher adventurer, she could recommend the protagonist to become an E rank or D rank adventurer directly. The protagonist was very interested. Upon arriving at the Adventurers Guild, the protagonist found Abel had returned. The adventurers all came out to greet her, but to avoid spoiling the atmosphere, he decided to go for a walk. He hadn't gone far when he encountered a fairy girl. The girl was surprised to see the Fairy King accessory on his waist, but said nothing and left. Abel, seeing him wandering around, brought him back to the guild and introduced him to everyone. Everyone was grateful that he had saved Abel, and the protagonist seemed quite excited surrounded by them. The next day, Abel took the protagonist to register as an adventurer, intending to register at rank D. The receptionist was somewhat surprised, as no one from Abel's Crimson Sword Guild had ever introduced anyone before. Seeing this, Abel stated that the protagonist was an exceptional talent, and that he and the guild leader were old acquaintances. After a brief introduction, he pulled out 2 large bags of magic stones, the protagonist's own. Upon seeing them, the guild leader recognized the magic stones as belonging to a dragon and was utterly astonished. Collecting so many high-quality magic stones required a nationwide campaign, yet the protagonist had accomplished it single-handedly. This alone was enough to prove the protagonist's strength. Just then, Abel's team arrived, and the protagonist, not wanting to interrupt their reunion, left. He used this time to complete his adventurer registration. There, he learned that the guild held a monthly dungeon bleeding lesson, explaining important points for beginners. He was encouraged to attend if he was interested. A short while later, the adventurer registration was complete. Before leaving, Abel asked the protagonist if there was anything he wanted. The protagonist said he didn't need anything, but asked Abel to buy him some spare clothes. That evening, Abel hosted a banquet, a gesture of goodwill to welcome the protagonist to the guild. After a night's rest, penniless, the protagonist arrived at the guild dormitory the next morning. He was to stay in a 4-person room. 2 of the occupants had clearly been there for a while, and after brief introductions, a newly registered adventurer arrived. While they were chatting pleasantly, an argument broke out with Abel. It turned out they had just learned just how abstract the protagonist's power was. He could unleash powerful, rapid-fire spells without a wand. He could instantly generate a wand tens of meters long. They were clearly incredulous at the protagonist's abilities. In their understanding, only a legendary fire mage could accomplish such a feat. Legend had it that this mage had burned over 1,000 kingdom soldiers to death with a single blow, blasted a dragon to smithereens, and even destroyed a city with a single strike. To be precise, the protagonist's strength was comparable to this legendary fire mage. If everything Abel said was true, then the protagonist was indeed a formidable and dangerous individual. If such people became their enemies, they could probably kill them all in an instant. Therefore, they absolutely could not allow the protagonist to be used by the Empire. But Abel said, "No, there is no Empire." Why could he say it? Because the Empire's name is the Lebshi Empire. This demon was incredibly unlucky. He thought he was just there to bully the weak, but instead, he ran into the protagonist, a tough nut to crack. That day, after attending a lecture for dungeon beginners, the protagonist embarked on his first practical adventure into the dungeon. The instructor explained as they walked that because the dungeon's monsters multiplied every few years, forming hives, a double protective barrier was erected both inside and outside the dungeon to defend against attacks from both sides. Upon arriving at the dungeon, the instructor announced free time, as the first level they were on was relatively safe. While exploring, the protagonist and his roommate, Amon, encountered a soldier ant monster. The protagonist remained remarkably calm. After all, such a low-level monster was no different from an ant in the real world to him. Then, the protagonist used a soldier ant spell to pin the ant monster to the ground and had Amon go after it, thus inducing Amon's greed. And so, for several days in a row, the protagonist and Amon explored the dungeon together. During the battle, the protagonist notices that Amon's swordsmanship is very similar to Abel's. It turns out that Amon has been striving to emulate Abel's skills. The protagonist encourages Amon, assuring him that with continued effort, he will eventually catch up to Abel's strength and perhaps even surpass him. The next day, the protagonist goes to the library near the guild to study alchemy. However, before he has studied for long, the library plunges into darkness. A solar eclipse has occurred outside. Upon stepping outside, the protagonist is surprised to find that the entire world has been reversed. He has clearly been pulled into a magical space. At this moment, the protagonist senses killing intent behind him and instinctively immediately uses an ice wall to defend against the attack. You've already absorbed the humans. Never mind, as long as we eliminate them, there won't be a problem. The source of the attack was the demon from the beginning. The demon launched flames again. Seeing this, the protagonist quickly released a wall of soldiers to block the attack. At this moment, the demon changed its attack method. A gust of wind hit the protagonist's shoulder. Unexpectedly, it didn't harm him. It turned out that the protagonist was wearing the Fairy King's robe, which could withstand most magical attacks. Seeing it was the Fairy King's robe, the demon used a physical attack. Unexpectedly, the protagonist blocked it with his sword. After a fierce physical clash, the demon questioned the protagonist. After the protagonist interrupted the charging fireball, the demon became enraged and slashed at the protagonist again. Then, a fierce magical clash ensued. Unexpectedly, the protagonist's magical strength was too overwhelming, breaking through the demon's defenses and injuring the demon. The male protagonist swiftly leaped forward, ready to finish off the demon. But the demon was no pushover. Not only did it block the protagonist's sword, but its regeneration speed was also astonishing. After landing, the demon charged up another fireball, only to be surrounded by water droplets. This was the protagonist's true killing move, a sudden incantation combined with a fusion magic that boiled the water. This completely ignited the demon's desire to fight the protagonist. However, the time limit in the spatial dimension expired, and the demon had to stop. It was a pity the time was too short. So many battles. When did it all begin? I'm so happy. Human. My name is Leonor Uraka Albrucale. Your name is... My name is Rio. Demon. After both introduced themselves, the demon said that it would be stronger next time they met and warned the protagonist not to be killed by other demons, then disappeared. After the battle, the protagonist breathed a sigh of relief. Back at the guild, the protagonist discovers his roommate has been bullied. The bullies have ambushed him in the training grounds, claiming it's to improve the roommate's vigilance. Seeing this, the protagonist quickly intervenes, retaliating in kind by knocking out the bully's henchmen and easily defeating the gang leader, finally getting revenge for his roommate. After his previous battle with the demon, the protagonist analyzed his weaknesses. While his combat strength could rival that of an S-rank monster, his speed was far inferior. To catch up with the demon's speed, he needed to learn a high-speed movement spell. However, he realized that most such spells were wind-based, while he could only use water and ice. He considered freezing the ground with ice, and then launching a stream of water from his back to use momentum for high-speed movement. But reality proved harsh. Not only was controlling the force difficult, but it was also easy to slip. Seeing this, the protagonist decided not to waste time on such a frustrating exercise. Instead, he'd rather go to the library to study the demon's weaknesses and then alchemy. The protagonist had always been interested in alchemy, but the library was too vast, and he couldn't find any relevant books. Just as he was fretting about this, a familiar figure appeared before him, the fairy girl he had met recently. As he hesitated whether to strike up a conversation, she introduced herself. Upon learning that the male protagonist was looking for books on alchemy, he offered to guide him. It turned out he frequented the library and knew the location of almost every book. While the two were chatting in the library, a major event occurred in the city. Someone had discovered goblin archery techniques belonging to the 10th level on the 5th level of the dungeon. Upon learning this, the guild leader immediately had a bad feeling, suspecting it was a harbinger of a great tsunami. He dispatched Abel's Crimson Arrows and another group called the White Brigade to investigate. Abel was the first to go, but even before reaching the entrance, a sense of foreboding arose within him. He then had the mage in his group use wind magic to probe the area. Sure enough, a large number of monsters were detected on the first level alone. They quickly closed the gate and called for backup from all the adventurers in the guild and the local knightly orders. Soon afterward, a horde of goblins broke through the gate and poured out. Although the number of monsters this time was exaggerated, they were well prepared. Utilizing double-layered protective arms and the combined defenses of their forces, they quickly brought the situation under control. Just as everyone breathed a sigh of relief, 3 goblin generals emerged, each a B-rank monster. However, the problem wasn't them. The appearance of 3 goblin generals meant there was an A-rank, D-rank goblin king inside. To be on the safe side, they decided to quickly eliminate the 3 goblin generals. But just as they dealt with 2, Abel sensed an intense killing intent. Dead. A single sword strike shattered a wall, making the situation situation extremely difficult. They didn't have any A-rank adventurers among them. With no other option, the two captains charged forward, but their attacks couldn't even break through the Goblin King's defenses. Conversely, any attack they received resulted in severe injury. Seeing the Goblin King about to unleash another strike, Abel quickly used his strongest attack. Escape! Escape! At this moment, the mage in the team also charged up his barrage attack. This perfect teamwork directly defeated the Goblin King. With the fall of the Goblin King, the tsunami finally ended. Just as they were excited about this, little did they know that an even greater crisis lurked deep within the dungeon.